Hey, all, thanks for watching. I just wanted to quickly inform you about my financial services agency, which operates in the life insurance space. So we help families with debt elimination plans and create tax-favored retirement solutions. We support small businesses, nonprofits, worker-owned co-ops, unions, and social enterprises with employee and member benefits. We offer white glove insurtech services to community banks, credit unions, financial co-ops, and CDFIs. And we provide enduring acceleration and downside capture strategies for all kinds of investors. Check out the link in the video description and enjoy the show. Hey, Michael, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm, I gotta say, I'm really glad I'm finally getting you on the show. You don't know this, but you're one of the big reasons that this show exists. And,
Really? Well,
yeah,
I'm eager
oh
to
yeah.
hear more.
Yeah, well,
And I hope the show
you
has been rewarding and you're not going to punish me for it.
Yeah, well, challenge and opportunity are the same word, right? So,
Right.
yeah, no, we actually, you probably don't remember, we met briefly back. I went to a Bali, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies conference back in 2013. I think that you may have been at in
Uh-huh.
Buffalo, New York, and
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
and I remember hearing you speak, and I was overwhelmed with all of the good stuff there. But on the way back, my boss at the time, Amanda Edmonds, who was the director
Oh,
of our urban
yeah.
farming healthy food access nonprofit, I was doing social
Right.
enterprise for them. And on the drive back from Buffalo to Detroit, I drove, and she read this report that you had made about an impact report on local investment. And then I read Local Dollars, Local Cents when it came out, and I
Okay.
became good
Cool.
on the. I knew Angela Barbash,
Yeah.
and and so what she's doing, what you've been doing, what Kevin Jones has been doing, who I've developed a bit of a relationship with, has been kind of what I wanted this whole thing to be about. So yeah, I'm just really grateful to have you here.
Fabulous.
This is actually going to be a special series that our radio show is going to be doing that's a little
Great.
different than my normal format show. And it's much more open ended. We can just kind of talk, and I just want to get to pick your brain and, kind of, obviously the plan is for Kevin to, and Rosalie to use this content as the lead up to the conference
Yep.
as well in San Antonio. Um, but yeah, I feel like we can look at things from a telescope view, from a microscope view. I guess I remember seeing like a TED talk that you had done that was how old now? Maybe 15 years ago. What
Yeah,
was it that what was
probably.
the
It
light
was
bulb
in.
on local investment for you? Like what was it that made you go like, "Oh, this thing."
Yeah. Well, I guess the answer would be that each book that I've done has solved questions that I started with and ended with questions that I haven't been able to figure out.
Hmm.
And the local investment questions just kept coming up and getting bigger and bigger, with each book. And they still are very big. Um, I mean, I feel like one way of understanding uh, the universe of local investment now is that we've changed the law, but we still haven't figured out how to mobilize large numbers of small businesses and grassroots investors to take advantage of the law. And that just is going to require a lot of work, organizing, and mobilization.
Yeah, when you say the law, I know you were kind of considered, somewhat of an architect of the Jobs Act. Is that the law that you're referring to most, or are there other pieces to that?
Well, the Jobs Act modified a big body of law that those of us who are, you know, unfortunate to be called lawyers have focused on for many years. And securities law is, I mean, it's, if you're in law school, you'll take an entire semester with it and barely scratch the surface. Um, but some of the law is around the issuing of securities. A security is a piece of paper with some kind of return associated with it. Some of the law is around the resale of those securities. Some is around the pooling of securities and funds, and some is around institutional investments out of, say, workplace pension funds. So in each of these areas, there's a million details, and the details pretty much stack up against low cost and easy investment in local business, people, and projects. And so the Jobs Act changed one piece of it, and it was a good step, but there's a lot more to do.
What was that step? What was that piece that it changed?
So the Jobs Act basically said, okay, before the Jobs Act, if a grassroots investor wanted to put a penny into a local business, that business would typically have to do 15, 25, $35,000 of securities work with an attorney in order to permit that act. And what did that act do? It produced a thick document, a disclosure document, often written in 8-point font that no human being has ever read or understood. But if you do read it, the essence of every page is you will lose everything. You will lose everything, page after page. And this is a ludicrous exercise. And what the Jobs Act did is said, okay, we can simplify this exercise, put it online, create federally licensed portals that facilitate the simplification and allow any company to raise up to $1 million per year. That was then amended to be $5 million and will allow any individual, even an individual, with small income, to put up to $2,200 of money into these businesses. So that was all fairly radical. And
Yeah.
what has happened since is that about 1.5 million people have put $2 billion into 7,000 companies. So it has changed something, but moving $2 billion in a universe where we should be targeting moving closer to 50 or 60 trillion dollars is a
Hmm.
very small act.
Yeah, it really is. Trillion is such a crazy number. I often use this to try to explain it a little bit to myself and to everybody else is that if you go back a million seconds, you go back about 11 days. If you go back a billion seconds, you go back 31 and a half years. And if you go back a trillion seconds, you're going back 31,500 years to hunter gatherer times. And
Yeah.
so to know that, you know, numbers like billions sound big, but that's nothing compared to 50 or 60 trillion. I do want to kind of just back up and zoom out. I know that especially coming out of the 2008 2009 crash and the subsequent recession and just seeing all the immense fraud and the just kind of disregard for the securities law or the manipulation of that securities law. I know there was a big movement at that time called Move Your Money that was about, shopping local and buying local. And what I think is so brilliant about what you're doing and what something that no matter who I talk to, they love the idea of, but they don't know how they can do it is to actually then invest their money local. But I think it's worth us spending a couple minutes here talking about what the actual impact of spending money local is rather than spending money at a big box store or something like that. Because I know people think they have like a general idea that it's a nice thing to do and it's good. But one thing I love about your work is you really break down just how good it is.
Yeah. So there have been dozens of studies around this point, and I'll just give you one example. In British Columbia in 2013, there was an analysis of how a dollar spent in British Columbia moves through retailers and restaurants. And if you if you spend that dollar in a locally owned independent restaurant and retailer, about 50 cents recirculates in the British economy, British Columbia economy.
Yep.
If you put that money into a chain, it's about 17 cents. And the reason is that locally owned businesses tend to spend their money because of their relationships with other locally owned businesses. So the money sticks around the community and multiplies. And the more times the money recirculates, the faster it recirculates, the more income, wealth, and jobs. In the case of British Columbia, what it showed is that every time a British Columbian resident mindfully spends a dollar on a locally owned restaurant and retailer, the province enjoys about 2.5 times the job effects, 2.5 times the wealth effects, 2.5 times the tax collections. It's really quite profound. And as I said, there have been many studies done along these lines. They tend to show that if you have two similar businesses, one locally owned, one not, or two similar industries, one locally owned, one not, the locally owned business or industry will generate 2 to 4 times the economic development impact of a non-locally owned entity. And there's really been no study that has ever contradicted that. So that is the profound reason why, if all things are equal, it is rational for a consumer to buy a good or a service from a locally owned entity, or why it is rational for an investor to put a dollar into a locally owned entity. That multiplier effect is huge. And if you think about it, every time you put money in Wall Street, you get a private rate of return, but you really get no local rate of return.
Mm,
Whereas if you invest your money in your community, not only do you get a private rate of return, but you get this boost in the economy, which increases the tax base, which puts people to work, which pays for police and schools, etc. Now, we can't quantify what that social impact is for any given person. It varies by your values, but we know it's not zero.
right.
And you cannot get that kind of social return from a Wall Street investment.
Yeah, you get not only an individual return, but you get a collective return. You get a
That's right.
community return. One thing I always like to say is we are each other. And in some way, we have to break down such an individualized way of thinking about everything and remember that we all depend on each other. Everything is interdependent and everything is interconnected in some way, especially in our economy. That's the material reality example of that philosophy, just kind of laid right out there. I also imagine it creates more stability and resilience against those kinds of market downturns and recessions that are caused by the national markets. If your local community is strong, it seems like it would be less dependent on the big banks and on Wall Street.
So there is a really wonderful book that was written, published this past year called Homecomings by a woman named Rana Forahar from the Financial Times. And what is really interesting is that she has written her entire life for the Financial Times and for a kind of a globalization audience. That those are her people. And
Right.
she concludes in the book that the old paradigm driven by David Ricardo, that every place should specialize in one good or service and get that competitive advantage and import everything else, that paradigm has completely fallen apart. for a lot of reasons. And so now resilience is front and center. Resilience is the new principle for successful economic development. Now, the problem is, I've seen since COVID every economic development agency add resilience to its mission statement. But what they usually mean by resilience is, well, if we're a coastal community and we see the ocean rising, we're going to bring some Dutch over to put up dikes so that we're a little more protected from the rising seas. Okay, that's part of resilience. But the other part of resilience that COVID taught us was being more self reliant, being able to feed yourself, being able to provide yourself with energy, with water, with housing, etc. And self reliance, we're not looking for perfect self reliance. That's ridiculous. But we are looking for higher levels of self reliance. If you can cost effectively feed yourself, you should do it because it not only is good for wealth generation, it is also good for protecting yourself against threats to the global food system you cannot possibly anticipate.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. There's because you have to look at that whole picture. You can't just slice it up and say, well, we'll just do this one part and think that you've solved it. And that's what I think your work on local investing is so important, is because it's not enough to just buy local for to see the real impact that we're talking about here. The investment dollars, the retirement savings that people are putting away each and every month typically go to companies that maybe they like them, maybe they don't, but they're not going to have that social and that collective impact on their local community. And so I guess moving from the idea of spending local to the idea of investing local seems like there's a big valley, this big kind of chasm between people being able, like, I get that, like, hey, I'm going to go to my local coffee shop instead of a chain one. Easy, done. But if you tell me, hey, we'll go invest your money locally, that's a whole different ball game. And I know that's what your work is a lot about. But what is, I guess, first I'd like to know, do you have studies on and data on what the impact of moving those retirement savings and those investment dollars are, and what kind of a future we could have in our communities if we were truly putting that investment dollars to work in our local communities on any level, whether it's all of it, half of it? Yeah, I just want to know what you've learned through your research.
Well, we don't have a lot of studies on the question you're asking, but I'll give you one that I think is really interesting. So, in 1998, the province of Nova Scotia in Canada allowed communities to set up neighborhood pension funds, and about
Hmm.
70 have been set up since then. One of the ones that I really love is called FarmWorks, which supports local food businesses and small scale farms. Now, Nova Scotia is a country with about 1 million people, and if we were to scale that up to the United States, we would have 21,000 neighborhood pension funds. That to me is a really exciting vision.
Yeah.
So, to induce Nova Scotians to put their money into the pension funds, the province provided a tax incentive, a pretty generous tax incentive for people to move their money. So, about 2 years ago, so what, 24 years after the enactment of this, they did a study looking at, okay, how many jobs came out of these investments and what was the cost per job in lost government money because of the tax credit. It turned out to be about $500 per job. Now, to
Hmm.
put that in perspective, we had 700 US jurisdictions competing for Amazon's second headquarters, and the vast majority of them were prepared to pay $500,000 to $1 million per job. So $500 per job, that is a real bargain. And this is the kind of economic development that is available if we do local investment. And let me point out one other thing too, which is, as you noted, most people are spending some of their money, if not most of their money, locally right now. And the reason is that most of what we spend our money on is services. And services are inherently local. We spend our money on local
Mhm.
services like healthcare or education or professional services like lawyers or architects or personal services like childcare because we know and trust somebody. When it comes to local investment, I do a little exercise when I speak to audiences. And so this is, in non-COVID times, maybe 50 times a year, I'll speak to audiences and I'll ask them by show of hands, how many of you have put at least 1% of your pension funds into local business? And there are almost no hands. And if one hand goes up, they're usually wrong. So we have this system where 60 to 80% of the economy is in locally owned business, and almost none of our investment capital is going into them. So we are all, including all of us who love local business, we are all systematically over-investing in Fortune 500 companies and under-investing in local business. And honestly, as long as you continue to invest in the wrong things, don't be surprised that you're going to be disappointed with the outcome.
Yeah, because I imagine most jobs are held by small local businesses too. And when we think about creating jobs, a lot of times the narrative that we have is that that's done by big companies. But my understanding is that about two-thirds of the jobs in the country are by small independent businesses.
Yes, so and there's a couple of different measures you can use on this. If you use the measure of size of business, so in the United States, we perversely define a small business as 500 employees or fewer. Most other countries do 200 or 100. But by that criterion, uh, it's about 60% of the economy is in small businesses. It's a stunningly large number. Now, um, you can go further than that, and there's another measurement system out there that says, well, let's look at the coincidence of a branch of a business and its headquarters. And when you look at that, about 80% of the economy is locally owned. So that's why I say it's
Mm.
60 to 80%. Um, and in terms of job creation, it,
And just to
it
cut in,
is a
they're
radical
doing
difference.
that, and they're doing that without the investment dollars that the big companies are using. I think I'm honestly pretty. It shows just the strength and resilience of small local business owners that they're able to have that large of a force and be that large of a force, I should say, without all those investment dollars that the big companies are getting and the subsidies too, right? So
Yeah, no,
that just speaks to the resilience of small local independent businesses.
absolutely. And uh, the way that I cynically often state that is, despite the best efforts of economic developers to kill local businesses by making them less competitive and giving all their money to large businesses, they have thrived and retained their market share fairly consistently.
Man. And I want to hit on something too, because I think a lot of people, when I've talked to them about the idea of local investing, think of it as this brand new idea, but it's actually a pretty old one. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you think about it, investing in your family or yourself or your town was the easiest thing to do. And it's only as we developed these kinds of first national and then global webs of capital that you could you had options for moving your money all around the planet. And I think that we want to reinvent this local investment infrastructure. Now, one thing that's, I think, helpful in thinking about this problem is we tend to think about investment as investment in business, and that is an important piece of it. But honestly, for most people, the most powerful local investments that they can make are in themselves and their family. So I'll give you two examples. One example, which is not a something that I'm proud of, but 2008 was a terrible year for me. It was a year that I got divorced, lost a job, and it was a financial crisis of global proportions. I wound up in very significant debt, staggering debt. And what I did to get out of debt is I approached people in my community who I knew had a little bit of means and said, look, I am paying 25% or more on certain credit cards. You're getting 5% or less on a bunch of your investments. Let's figure out a number in between that will make us both happy. And in crowdfunding for my own debt relief, I was able to save about $100,000 in interest payments. And fast forward to today, I'm completely out of debt and have an amazing credit score. But it was all because I was able to crowdfund locally out of debt.
Yeah,
So
you have
that's
this
example one.
example. Yeah, you have this
Yeah,
example in your most recent book, Put Your Money Where Your Life Is, where you say, hey, if you have a, even if it's not such a high crazy interest rate, but if you have a family member who has a student loan for 7 or 10%, and you can lend them, you've got some cash laying around and you want to make a return on that, instead of, making that return on Wall Street, you can lend that to them, have them pay off the debt that's at a higher interest rate, and then they pay you back at, 5 or 6 or whatever percentage you guys figure out. You make a return that it helps your family member or your friend, and you've just made a local investment without even having to go through securities laws and changing the structure or changing the way things are done. And
that's right.
just
And the
yeah,
rate
yeah.
of return is spectacular. That's the thing.
Hmm.
The rate of return I got on that investment was probably typically 20%.
Yeah.
And I'll give you another example. So, in the last 2 years, the most successful investment that my wife and I have made is putting solar on the roof here.
Hmm.
And we moved 2 years ago to Palm Springs, California. It's a desert. Our air conditioning bills in certain months were as high as like $750. So since putting the solar on the roof, we have no utility bill, and we pay ourselves back. That is, we borrowed money from our solo 401k, which is our own little pension savings account based on self-employment, and we pay ourselves back at a low interest rate. The interest goes back into our account. So again, we're getting a double-digit rate of return on this kind of investment in ourselves. And if you think about it, well, why stop there? Why not? We should also be investing in our neighbors putting solar on their roof because we'll get the same rate of return. Uh, so there is almost an endless supply of these kinds of investments before you even confront the question of putting money into businesses, whether local or non-local.
Well, and that concept of seeing, I think, especially paying off debt as an investment into yourself is so powerful because you say that, you know, if you think of it kind of as an iceberg and, you're gaining your money in the market is gaining 8% or 9% or something like that. But then you put in $200 a month, let's say, into the market and it's gaining 8 or 9%. But then you've got another $200 credit card payment that's 25%. At the end of the day, what's your net? You're still at negative 18%. And that was hugely powerful in my own life. I'll share my own debt story since you shared yours. In 2020, that was a pretty bad year for me. I had also gone through a divorce. I had moved across the country 3 times. I had to
Mm.
refurnish my life. And then right around the time when the pandemic hit, my business fell apart with that, and my income went down over 6 figures in one year. And I also racked up a lot of debt because I was paying for stuff from when it was good, right? And I actually, through some of your concepts and through some other things that I had learned, put our financial services agency with a focus on helping people eliminate their debt faster. And it's exactly what you said. People don't realize just how much they're paying in interest. A 5% mortgage, you're going to be paying 50% of the balance of that home by the end of it. And most of the clients we help, we're able to get them out of debt in 7 to 12 years instead of 30. And on average, they save about $70,000 to $75,000 of interest during that time. And what I love that you said about it is that looking at the difference between, well, this is an investment and this is a debt, and kind of thinking of them in this two pocket sort of thinking is a distinction without a difference.
Yeah, it's something the financial services industry wants us to do because they want those of us who are in debt to justify continuing to put money into their financial instruments. But as you point out, it's nutty to do that. Now, I mean, there are exceptions, and for those listening, if you're in a workplace where your employer is matching your, say,
Oh, yeah.
401k uh, contributions, yeah, it probably makes sense for you to max out those, even if you have some debt, because if you're getting a 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1 additional amount of money from your employer, you don't want to lose that. But that's not all that common.
Yeah,
So
or if
I
you're
think for,
using debt to buy an asset where you're getting a
yeah,
larger rate of return than the interest rate, that makes sense. But for
yep,
consumer goods, that's where people, and myself included, definitely have gotten into trouble. I also wanted to ask you a little bit about, I think some of the sort of eyebrow raising questions that people might have when we talk about local businesses, specifically around risk. I think that a lot of people see startup businesses as risky. People hear stats about how, the majority of small businesses fail. Why would I invest my money locally when I could, put it in a company that I know is secure and solid? And why would I put it into this startup or this local thing because it's so much riskier? Could you speak a little bit to what that risk actually is? Because there obviously is some, but I'm curious through your research what you've learned about that.
yeah. So there is no question that startups, whether or not they are locally owned, are highly risky. And the majority of startups will not be here in 5 years. However, startups are a tiny piece of what your local investment opportunities are. And if you are a risk averse local investor, you simply need to ask the threshold question, is has this business been around for 5 or 10 years or not? And a lot of the businesses you will find have been around. It's a grocery store that's building a second branch. It is a restaurant that's popular on one side of town that wants to put another restaurant on the other side of town. Those are the things that you want to look at.
Mm.
Um, but there also are people who are more interested in risky investments. And if risk is your thing, then investing in startups makes sense. But the mistake that a lot of people make is the assumption that every local investment is a startup. And that's
Mm.
nonsense. The vast majority of local investment opportunities are not startups.
Right, because just because something's local doesn't mean it doesn't have a track record.
Yeah, that's right. And so that's one issue. And I think you need to be a little bit systematic about this. And what I mean by that is you need to line up all of the risks of investing locally against all of the risks of investing non-locally,
Hmm.
and weigh out how these things come out. So I'll give you an example. Um, if you put all of your money into local businesses, you're going to be vulnerable to a local recession. And every community has localized recessions. It can happen because of a natural disaster or a company splits town. And if your portfolio is 100% local, you're going to potentially lose everything. So that's why there may be an argument for some degree of geographic diversification. On the other hand, we also know that people who evaluate companies locally get much better information. They have
Hmm.
the ability to test out the good or the service, ground truth the representations, talk with the employees, talk with management, and really get a clear headed view about whether to do the investment. That is almost impossible to do globally. And this is why, by the way, community banks, which mostly do relationship based lending, have lower default rates than global banks, which rely on electronic credit scores, because those
Hmm.
electronic credit stores know a lot less than the people with relationships. So that is the reason why, okay, a smart local investor will not put 100% into the community. You'll put maybe 5%, 10%, and you'll put it into businesses that you've done some due diligence around. But by the way, if you want geographic diversification, you find other communities that are looking for geographic diversification, and you put together local funds that are supporting local businesses across multiple geographies. So that is the direction that local investment is going to move in. We're not there yet, but it is going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's definitely, as someone who's been in financial services now for, almost 10 years, there is a bit of a misconception out there, especially I think from Wall Street, the stock market, the bond market, these large institutions that and the big banks that you need us in order to survive. And I think that what your work shows is that there are ways actually that we can take our financial power back into our local communities. And this is definitely one of them. And that's not to say that no one, like none of someone's money should be in the stock market or the bond market, but you don't have to do it all. And you also, like you said, it doesn't have to be just in local businesses. There's also things like real estate, like, like friends and family loans. There's a lot of creative and innovative ways that people can do local financing and get both a financial rate of return, but also that social and communal rate of return as well.
Yeah, and so about 2 years ago, I started this newsletter called the Main Street Journal
Yeah, I was going to
because,
ask you about and
uh,
to tell everyone about that. I have this thing called the balance sheet that I do as my monologue usually, where we go over the assets, liabilities, debts, and investments towards a more mindful marketplace. And I pull so much information from the Main Street Journal for my assets and investments column. I have to tell you, it's without it, I don't think I could do that each and every week.
well, that's wonderful to hear. Thank you for that information. But I what I found just personally is I was drowning in information, and
Hmm.
it was silly for me to get this information and not find a way to share it with others. And so the Main Street Journal has been my way of getting all of these examples out there of clever ways that communities are beginning to invest locally, and it varies a lot from community to community, varies a lot internationally. Um, and so every week I'm just it's a fire hose of innovation that I find really exciting. Um, because yeah, I think it's probably the case that 20 years from now, most of us will be investing in instruments or techniques or projects that we've never heard of.
Hmm. What do you mean?
Well, I'll give you an example. Like there may be, so now we have land trusts. Community land trusts are
Yeah.
really important pieces of strategy in dealing with affordable housing. And a great example, probably the greatest example of a community land trust in the United States, is in the 1980s, an obscure mayor from Burlington, Vermont, Bernie Sanders, uh, raised $100,000 in municipal bonds and put it into the Champlain, what became the Champlain Community Land Trust. Today, that land trust is worth $100 million and provides housing for 2,000 people in Burlington,
Hmm.
affordable housing. Uh, Now, that was not a local, I mean, yes, he used municipal bonds as a way
Hmm.
of supporting this, but it was not grown through local investment. And one could easily imagine creating a fund on top of a community land trust that allowed grassroots investors to put money into the land trust so they can accelerate their acquisition of properties and grow the affordable housing for more people. So that's what I mean. It's hard to find an example where that's happening right now at scale in the United States. But I think in 20 years, we'll see a lot of examples of that.
Hmm. That's exciting. I mean, I was familiar with community land trust, but I did not know that about Burlington. That's an incredible success story. And I know that with the Main Street Journal, you've come across a lot of other success stories. Do you have any other more recent ones that really stood out to you?
Well, I'll tell you, to me, the most impressive success story is a smallish one in Port Townsend, Washington. So Port Townsend is a small town, 10,000 people, about 2 hours drive north of Seattle. And
Near Bellingham or so
starting,
then.
yeah, no, it's kind of in that direction, but it's more inland.
Okay.
Um, and Port Townsend, um, in 2007 set up a a club they called Lion, Local Investment Opportunity Network. And the idea was that they would have a potluck dinner that brought together local investors and local businesses completely informally. Because it turns out that if you formalize certain presentations and so forth, you start skating on the edge of what's permissible under securities law. So, no format and nothing in securities law can stop people from forming relationships. Well, just that act of forming relationships has led to $1 million per year going into local investment in a 10,000 person town. And
Hmm.
this was so impressive that the Washington State Department of Commerce has been pouring money into spreading Lion across rural communities in the state. I think there's a dozen. They have a slightly different name. What is it? Local Investment Networks, LINs. Um, but to me, it's a small scale success story. But what it shows is that sometimes what is necessary to move the ball is something so trivial, like putting relationships together in a potluck dinner.
Hmm. That's incredible. And I think that it just goes to show that if you're just willing to think creatively and willing to kind of drop the illusion that there's only one way to gain a return on money, that there's only one way to invest, that there really are unlimited ways that we can impact our communities, impact our families, impact our own futures for the better in the process. I am curious because I'm sure that, you know, obviously, I think there's a lot of times when we talk about investing, the tendency is to always want to kind of compare that to the stock market and to what is kind of business as usual as it is right now. You actually have an entire section in your book called Beating the Street, where you sort of break down that comparison. And I would love for you to sort of start and unpack some of that with this quote that I wrote down here from you, where you said, let's question the premise that the stock market is the right benchmark for success.
Yeah. Uh, and the reason for that is because, as we talked about, there are so many investment opportunities around yourself, getting yourself out of debt, getting your kids out of debt, putting solar on the roof, buying a house instead of renting, that are going to deliver unbelievable rates of return, much higher than Wall Street. Uh, Now, I think that Wall Street has become the kind of gold standard of success for whatever set of cultural reasons. And the thing is that if you listen to bad radio on AM in your car, I think many of us still have that. You drive around on Saturday and Sunday, and many of the shows you're likely to tune into are these, kind of uh, dime a dozen financial advice shows. And what they will tell you is that if you leave your money in Wall Street long term, you're going to get 10%, 12%, 20% rate of return. And I will just tell you, all of these numbers are made up. All of these numbers are cherry picking the entry and the exit point in Wall Street. They are also cherry picking by giving you inflation ridden numbers rather than real rates of return. If you Here's how you can actually look at how Wall Street has performed, which is go to the website of Robert Shiller. Robert Shiller is a professor at Yale. He wrote a wonderful book called Irrational Exuberance. His personal website has the rate of return of the S&P 500 every month since the S&P 500 was invented more than 100 years ago. And he also gives you the inflation rate of the month. He gives you the dividend rate of the month that's typically being paid out. And if you put those numbers together, the best number you will come up with is about 7 or 8%. Now, 7 or 8% is a pretty damn good rate of return for most
Mm-hmm.
people. Here are the caveats. So, caveat number one, all of us pay a transaction fee. That transaction
Right.
fee in our mutual fund is probably close to about 1 or 2%, depending on your fund choice. So, knock that off the top. Caveat number two is that it is it is exceedingly difficult to choose the right point of entry and exit. You cannot possibly know when you're going to need that money. And so all of us in our wonderfully imperfect lives are going to choose poorly. And so you're never going to get that maximum rate of return. So if you're pretty smart and pretty lucky, maybe you'll get closer to 5% rate of return. All right, 5% is still a pretty decent benchmark. Um, but then, if you are looking at 5% as your target rate of return, there are lots and lots of local investments that can match or beat that.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what I encourage people to think about.
So another piece of this, I went ahead and brought this up here so you can see it too. Can you see this?
Yes.
Because a lot of times what people don't realize, what I just for the listeners here, what I just brought up is the real S&P index since 1913 and the length of real downturn in the market. So one great example of this is that I'll make it bigger here. One great example of this is most people think about 2008 as this great downturn, and obviously it was. But the thing is that in 2006 and 2007, the market had not actually gotten back up to where it was after the downturn back in 2000 with the dot com bubble. We didn't actually get out of the dot com bubble downturn until 2015. So that means that if
Right.
you had your money in the market in the 90s, you then had downturn for 15 years before you
That's right.
actually got back your money. The same thing, there was a this one over here is from 1929 to 1958. That's almost a 30-year downturn. And then 1968 to 1992, we're talking another 25-year downturn. And so when people think of, of local investments as being these big risky things, Wall Street typically doesn't talk about that. The fact that their up cycles are about 7 years on average, but the downturns are in between 15 and 30 years.
Yeah, that's a great chart. And I noticed Robert Schiller was one of the sources on it.
Oh, really? That's great. Well, there you go. I didn't even know that. We should, that's great minds find similar sources, I guess.
Yeah, well, but they're honest sources. That's the thing. Schiller's not trying to sell you anything. He's just
Hmm.
trying to point out what the real returns of this are. And look, there are lots of people who lose lots of money on Wall Street, and the point is, everything we were just talking about was in balanced index funds. The truth is that most financial advisors underperform the indexes every year.
Mm,
Like two
yeah.
thirds underperform. And that one third that overperforms over a 5 year period is diminished down to about 5%. So it's, you know, I understand people's attraction to gambling, but let's not call it community economic development. It is gambling.
Yeah, and when you think about just the vast amount of fraud and rule breaking that happened in the 2008, in the lead up to the 2008 crash, and then you think about how things really did not change. I mean, in 2015, these hedge funds started using these bespoke tranche opportunities, which are just collateralized debt obligations all over again. And then just 2 weeks ago, I saw a Wall Street Journal article about how banks are unloading their risk through synthetic risk transfers, which, when you look into it, look a whole lot like credit default swaps. And so none of that stuff really has changed or is doing anything. And I, you know, I like to make the joke, what's the difference? You mentioned gambling. What's the difference between Vegas and Wall Street? Is, well, Vegas is really well regulated.
Yeah, but that's a fair point. I teach about a third of my time. I teach at Bard College has a business school, a green MBA program, and I teach the introductory economics class to all students. And I have my students watch the documentary Inside Job about the
Mm,
collapse of Wall Street after the 2008 crisis. And one of the assignments that I give to my students is say, okay, pick one significant cause of the financial crisis and just do do an hour of internet research to see what has changed in that cause in 20 years. And what they come up with is it's just staggering. It's same as you. Very little has changed. We have the same problems except they're dressed up in different ways. So yeah, let's simplify this problem for your listeners. We all know that diversification of your portfolio is valuable. Wall Street convinces you. that if you diversify your portfolio with so-called small cap or big cap stocks or bonds, value or growth stocks, that this is going to provide diversity. No, because all of these things are interconnected like a Rube Goldberg terror machine. Okay? If you want diversification, invest in yourself, invest in your community, invest in things that are really disconnected from this larger Rube Goldberg machine.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It doesn't make yeah, that's like saying I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but yeah, that's like saying invest, diversify your real estate portfolio because of, rising sea levels. And so you just buy another property that's also on the coast, It's
Right,
like it
right.
doesn't
We'll get a yeah.
um so I know when it comes to actual like process ways that people can go about doing local, regenerative, sustainable, catalytic investing. There's a lot of different words that people are using for eliminating that two pocket thinking where money has to only be, this pocket is for making lots of money and this pocket is for giving a little bit. And that's just there, though never the two shall meet. Um, I know that to get more information on that, people really should go to the Main Street Journal. I think it's one of the best resources. There are other ones like Impact Alpha. There are other groups and communities that are doing lots of things. And I wish we had the time, honestly, to just go through all of that stuff and all the ways that people could do local, whether it's crowdfunding, whether it's community funds, whether it's also working with a values based or a local advisor. They do exist. There's not a lot of them. And that's one of the big barriers that I see right now in the ecosystem is that there's not a lot of properly trained advisors. Because you go to most advisors and you say, hey, I want to invest locally, they're going to look at you like you're crazy, like you're cross eyed, and they're just going to send you out the door or say, well, you can't do that here. Um, I guess, you know, I'm curious, what do you see changing right now, or what do you see coming up on the horizon that you are excited about that's going to make this more accessible for your average person? But also, like, we can talk about what are the real barriers that still exist and that need to be overcome for that to be a reality where it is as convenient for, someone working a job and wanting to save for retirement to do so in a regenerative, local, and impactful way.
So I'll give you three examples of things that are happening right now that I think are exciting and harbingers of the future. So one is that the National Coalition for Community Capital, also known as NC3,
Mm-hmm.
they have come up with a design of a community investment fund
The
called the
DSIF.
Diversified
Yeah.
Community Investment Fund. And it's a modified real estate company is really what it is. It's most of the capital goes into real estate, some of it goes into local businesses linked to or sitting on the real estate. And it's a very clever design of a fund that greatly reduces the costs of setting it up because they found a nice set of exemptions within the Investment Company Act. And so they've got, I don't know, at this point, there's probably half dozen communities around the US that are setting up at various stages of setting up DCIFs. And if this continues, if they are successful, it invites every community to do this. So that's one great thing. Second example, where I am in California, about 3 years ago, the state passed a law enabling communities to set up public banks. Now, public banking, I'm not going to, we could talk a long time about it, but the short definition of public banking is not necessarily where the state or the city takes on banking activities, but rather when a state or a city is managing its budget, they collect money from taxpayers, they collect money from federal transfers, and then they have to do something with that money before they spend it. Usually they'll put that money into Chase Manhattan and then it goes internationally. What public banks do is put that money in local banks or credit unions and uses it to enhance local lending to local businesses. So we now have, I think, like 4 or 5 communities in California that are have serious public banking initiatives underway, and so we'll see those operating fairly soon, and I think those will spread. Third example, state of Michigan is on the verge of
My
passing
home
a
state.
50% tax credit for local investors. Um,
Hmm.
and what's been so interesting about this bill is this we got this bill to be introduced by Republican legislators 2 years ago. They then got thrown out of office. So we got the same bill now introduced by Democrat legislators. And I think literally in the next week or two, this thing is going to be law. Now, you don't get 50% indefinitely. There's a ceiling of about $3,000 or $4,000 on it. But still, that is a huge incentive. It's very much akin to the kind of incentive that I pointed out in Nova Scotia 20 plus years ago.
Hmm.
Um, and if this begins to work in Michigan as an economic development tool, you will see 30 other states quickly follow.
Yeah, that's incredible. I had heard brief rumblings about that bill in Michigan. I moved to Western North Carolina from the Detroit area, and I have a big heart for that scrappy, beat up state, and to see so much of the regenerative work around this come out of there, whether it's from what Revalue is doing, where Angela Barbash, who we had on the show, or what the other people in that state are doing. So that warms my heart on several levels. I want to let the sociology student in me come out for a second and ask you what effect on broader social problems, like inequality, and all the things that go along with inequality. What effect do you see local investment having on those issues?
Huge. Uh, and I'll give you a couple of pieces of evidence. There is a study that was done by the Federal Reserve in Atlanta in 2013, looking at counties across the United States. And in those counties with the highest density of thriving locally owned business, there is the there was the highest per capita income growth rate. So if you want to grow income and reduce inequality, supporting local businesses turns out to be your best ticket for doing so.
Hmm.
Another example, um, the the crowdfunding history that we've had since 2016. And I mentioned before, 1.5 million people putting $2 billion into 7,000 companies. Well, the disproportionate beneficiaries of that have been entrepreneurs who are women and people of color because
Hmm.
crowdfunding has cracked open a capital marketplace that historically was redlined and unavailable for women and people of color and makes it more available to them. So I think the early signs are very positive that this will be good for reducing inequality.
Yeah. I mean, I assumed it would, but I wanted to double check with you, obviously, but also just, I can't see a way in which it wouldn't when instead of extracting wealth from communities, we are reinvesting and recirculating that wealth within communities. How could it not do things like raise median wages? How could it not do things like allow cities to have better environmental standards because they know that that company's not just going to get up and take off because of it. I'm gonna I don't mean to just rant and kind of talk about pet peeves here, but whenever communities put so many subsidies and efforts into attracting some big giant company to come in and create all these jobs, yeah, there's a temporary boom to that. But if they moved there because your state or your county gave them some great tax break or some great subsidy, what's going to happen the next time a different state or a different county or a different municipality offers them a better one? They're
Yeah,
gone, you know. And
yeah,
you mentioned um, you mentioned this being significantly impactful for for entrepreneurs and businesses that come from disenfranchised communities. And that is a lot about what the Neighborhood Economics Conference that you're going to be speaking at and participating at the end of February in San Antonio is about. It's a wonderful combination of bringing in these catalytic investors who want to invest their dollars into these communities to see that social return, along with entrepreneurs from those disenfranchised communities and the faith groups and other nonprofit groups from those areas to help support in those efforts. I'm curious what you're most excited by neighborhood economics and by this conference that's coming up.
So there are two things that I love about the neighborhood economics contingent. And, I've been involved in many different local economy groups for the last 30 years. So I was involved in the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, Bali, and Social Ventures Network, and Businesses for Social Responsibility, and I have already mentioned National Coalition for Community Capital. I mean, there's a long list of groups. These groups tend to be white, and white, upper middle class, privileged people. I feel like neighborhood economics has really been able to bring in a lot of the traditional community development um, organizations that are heavily people of color. So that's number one. Number two is a lot of those people um, are also religiously affiliated. And so neighborhood economics has brought in kind of the religious social development organizations that are, I think, particularly important in more conservative states like Texas. And and I feel like that all of the things that we've talked about are just as relevant to conservative as progressive states.
Oh yeah.
And as I pointed out with the Michigan example, local investment is equally attractive to both Republican and Democrat legislators. So I think that the political fulcrum, the ideological fulcrum of neighborhood economics is very much in the center. And that excites me because I think that is a way of moving this entire enterprise faster.
Yeah, and even more so than being in the center, what I see is that it has found a catalytic issue that everyone can agree on and forget about the divisiveness and the disagreements for a minute. Because there
Yes.
are times where single issues will unite coalitions of people who may otherwise disagree. And rather than have litmus tests of, ideological litmus tests in order to partnership, being able to partner across other disagreements around something that we can all see is so good for all of us, I think is such a powerful and unique and really special thing. And I'm really, really excited for that conference. And I'm excited to get to hear you talk at it and get to, shake your hand in person there and everything. I guess to go out for the show here, I am I'm curious if you have a vision. What do you envision the future of community economics to be?
Yeah. So I have a project that is kind of in co-ate right now. It's been in co-ate for many years, but really just beginning to sort of build it out, called the Lokopedia. And the idea of the Lokopedia is creating an international open source database of successful small scale business models and business support systems. And I feel like providing these models of community self reliance and getting people to work on them is the way we're going to solve a bunch of international problems. So, as we're doing this interview right now, we have, um, COPEX meeting in Dubai. Um, they're not going to get anything done. I mean, it's a bunch of hot air, uh, making declarations. It's like the Beatles song, no nowhere man making nowhere plans for nobody. Um, and I feel like if we can get communities across the world, and it is happening, but we just need to accelerate it, communities to share their best practices on local food and local energy and local manufacturing, we are going to move things along at an astonishing rate. So that's, to me, the future of the local economy movement. It's making it transnational, it is making it collaborative, it's understanding that every community should become as self reliant as possible and give away its trade secrets to other communities on how they got there.
I love that. As you're talking, it's coming to me, and I'm realizing that when I think about history and I think about, society, and I think about economics, and I think about, just in my own life, in my own personal experience, all the best stuff happens together. All the best stuff happens when we are working together. And I'm so grateful that we got to have this conversation. I'm so grateful. Just thank you for all of the work, and because I'm sure that this is a long process. Angela Barbash, when we were talking about this radical change of the way economics are done, she said, it took us 500 years to get here. We're not going to get out in 10. It's going to take a long time. But I'm really, really grateful for you. I really, truly am, Michael, and I'm really, really grateful that we got to spend this time here together today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the questions. I appreciate the nice plugs, and I hope we do this again soon.